Okay, we're going to make a start now. So welcome everyone to our A Level AQA Biology session. In today's lesson, we are going to be looking at A-level content, so not the stuff that you'd look at in year 12, but the stuff you'd look at in year 13. We're going to be looking at the light-dependent reaction. As I've mentioned in the message, this will be useful for both year 12s and year 13s. Year 12s to get a head start, and for year 13s, we're going to be looking at some essay points that you can also include in your paper 3 when you get onto that paper as well towards the end of today's lesson. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know in the Q&A and I'll be more than happy to answer them for you. Okay, so we're going to be looking at the light-dependent reaction. Now, the light-dependent reaction is basically is basically a stage in photosynthesis. Okay, and there are two stages in photosynthesis. In photosynthesis, you have your light-dependent reaction, which over here is shown by this part of the spec. And then you have another reaction, which is known as the light-independent reaction. That is also known as the Calvin cycle. Okay, and that we will be looking at in our next sort of A-level biology year 13 lesson. Okay, and that's shown by this area of the spec. So as you can see, photosynthesis is a big area of the spec. You will get asked questions on photosynthesis across either your paper 2 or your paper 3. There is a required practical for photosynthesis as well. But in terms of content, the main aspects that you tend to get assessed on is either the light-dependent reaction or the light-independent reaction. And the reason why I've included essay points in today's lesson is because this is a very common topic that people talk about when it comes to essays, because it's a topic which sort of matches with a lot of essay titles in paper 3, and I'll give you a few examples of essay titles that it matches with as well when we get on to that part in today's lesson. Okay, so if we start off, we're going to have a bit of an overview for photosynthesis. So remember, photosynthesis is part of it's a process which plants use to absorb sunlight, absorb light energy in order to produce glucose, which is used by the plant, or to produce sort of oxygen, which is then taken in for respiration. Okay, so it's really important because plants without photosynthesis, they wouldn't be able to survive. So it's really vital that they have photosynthesis. And if we think back to sort of common knowledge, photosynthesis occurs in the chloroplast. Okay, now chloroplasts, they have chlorophyll, which is a green pigment within the leaf, and then that pigment is what absorbs different wavelengths of sunlight. So an overview of photosynthesis. So we know that it's a two-stage reaction, and that's what we've already looked at. You've got the light-dependent stage, which we're going to be looking at in today's lesson. That's the first stage. And then you've got the second stage, which is your light-independent reaction, which is also known as the Calvin cycle. Okay, now these are commonly abbreviated to LDR and LIR. So whenever I mention LDR, I mean the light-dependent reaction, and whenever I mention LIR, that means the light-independent reaction. Now, when we're looking at the light-dependent reaction, this reaction is basically dependent on light. So we know that photosynthesis requires light. Only the first stage of photosynthesis requires light. And if the first stage can't be done, then we can't progress onto our next stage. So the light-dependent reaction requires light energy. Without the light energy, the first stage of photosynthesis can't happen, which means photosynthesis can't happen at all. Okay, now both of these reactions, the light-dependent reaction and the light-independent reaction, they occur within the chloroplast. However, they occur at different areas of the chloroplast. And if you think back to sort of cells and the structure of cells, we had a look at the structure of a chloroplast and the key structures of each of the organelles that you are required to know. So if you think back, nucleus has a nucleolus, a nuclear envelope, nuclear pores. Those are internal structures within a nucleus. Just like that, we looked at the structure of a chloroplast. And inside a chloroplast, you have different structures as well. Now, the two key structures that you need to pay attention to is the thylakoid membrane and the stroma. Okay, now the light dependent reaction, the LDR stage, the first stage of photosynthesis, occurs in your thylakoid membrane. Okay, or your grana, which is just stacks of your thylakoid membrane. The light independent reaction occurs in the stroma, and the stroma is like the fluid-like material that you have within your chloroplast. Okay, so there are two stages for photosynthesis. The first stage is the light dependent reaction, and then the second stage is the light independent reaction. The light dependent reaction occurs in your thylakoid membrane, and your light independent reaction occurs within your stroma. Okay, two different aspects of a chloroplast. Now, as I said, the light-dependent reaction, it is the first stage of photosynthesis, and it's the stage which requires light because it's dependent on light. Without light, that reaction is not going to function, which means that photosynthesis is not going to occur at all. So that's the first stage of photosynthesis, the light-dependent reaction, and it's dependent on light. Now, once it receives the light and water, remember, if we look at the equation for photosynthesis, we know that carbon dioxide and water, they react and they use the light energy to form your glucose and your oxygen. That's your equation for photosynthesis that you should remember back from GCSE. You have your CO2 reacting with your H2O using the help of light energy to form your glucose and your oxygen as your products. Now, carbon dioxide is a reactant. However, in the light-dependent reaction, we don't actually use carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide comes in for the second stage of the reaction, which is the light-independent reaction. It's independent of light. It doesn't need light. It needs carbon dioxide. In the first stage of the reaction, in the light-dependent reaction, you're going to have light and you're going to have H2O. Okay, you're going to have both of them. Those are your reactants that you're going to be using in terms of photosynthesis and the light-dependent reaction. Okay, now the products which are created in the first stage of photosynthesis in the light-dependent reaction, the products are then used in the second stage of photosynthesis. That's why it's really important that the first stage goes ahead so the second stage can go ahead, which means that the overall photosynthesis process can actually occur because the products from the first stage, they are then used in the next stage. Okay. So the light energy and the water, it is used to create ATP, which is needed for energy, and reduced NADP. Now, many people get confused with reduced NADP. What does that actually mean? If something has been reduced, that means it's just gained a hydrogen. Okay, so you can write this as NADPH. Okay, this is also a way of writing reduced NADP. If something has been reduced, that means that it has gained a hydrogen. If you remember oil rig, oxygen is the loss of electrons and the gain of oxygen. If it's the gain of oxygen, it's also the gain of hydrogen. Okay, so oxidation is the loss of electrons and reduction. Oxidation is the loss of electrons and reduction. So oxidation is the loss of electrons, reduction is the gain of electrons. Okay, it's the gain of hydrogen. So the products are then used in the next stage, which is the light-independent reaction. Okay, but don't worry about that final point too much. We'll get through that when we look at the process. Now, the light-dependent reaction, there are 4 key stages of the light-dependent reaction. Okay, and the 4 key stages are these 4. The photolysis of water, the photoionization of chlorophyll, chemiosmosis, and then the production of ATP, and reduced NADP. Now, the last point is not really a process. The first 3 are processes. The first and the third, the photolysis of water and the chemiosmosis, is probably the most sort of knowledge-heavy stages of the light-dependent reaction. But we'll get through them all over the next couple of slides. Okay, so those are the four key stages of the light-dependent reaction. You've got the photolysis of water, photoionization of chlorophyll, chemiosmosis, and the production of ATP and reduced NADP. Now, let's talk about the photolysis of water. Now, the photolysis of water, this is basically the knowledge that you need to be aware of when it comes to the photolysis of water. Okay, and we'll go through this point by point. Okay, so first of all, okay, we've got our chloroplast, we've got our chlorophyll. When light shines down on the leaf, the light energy is going to be absorbed by the chlorophyll. Okay, and the plant is always going to have a store of water, or let's say if it's raining and then the plant gains a store of water, the water is also used. So in the photolysis of water, we'll split up what that actually means. Photo means light, lysis means splitting. So what that means is that we are splitting water using light energy. Okay, so the plant is going to have a store of water. Now this water has to be split apart. Now to split this water apart, light energy is what breaks it apart into its sort of smaller components. And the smaller components include oxygen, electrons, and hydrogen ions. Those are the components that water is split into. Okay, so we've got our leaf, we've got our chloroplast. Inside our chloroplast, we've got our chlorophyll. The light energy is absorbed by the chlorophyll, and the light energy is what breaks the water, which is present in the plant, down into oxygen, electrons, and hydrogen ions. This equation is the balanced symbol equation, which you are expected to know. So please do make a note of that. And there's a reason why it's split into these three components, because these three components are really important when it comes to the process of photosynthesis, because without these components, an aspect of photosynthesis wouldn't be able to occur. So the water, which is present in the plant and has been broken down by the light energy, has split into oxygen, electrons, and hydrogen. Now, what's going to happen? Let's start off with the hydrogen ions. Now, remember, when anything picks up a hydrogen ion, it becomes reduced. So NADP is a coenzyme. Okay, it's a coenzyme that's going to be present within the chloroplast already. What's going to happen is that the NADP coenzyme that you have present within your chloroplast, it's going to pick up the hydrogen ions. So we know that the hydrogen ions have been broken apart and we formed hydrogen ions from the water. The hydrogen ions are going to combine with the coenzyme NADP. And when it combines with the coenzyme of NADP, it becomes reduced NADP, which is NADPH. Okay, because remember, when anything picks up hydrogen, it becomes reduced. So NADPH is reduced NADP. And the reason why that process actually occurs is because NADPH is required for the next stage of photosynthesis. Okay, so it's required for the next stage of photosynthesis, which we're not looking at today in today's lesson. We're only looking at the first stage. Okay, so we know that light energy has been absorbed by the chlorophyll. Okay, and the light energy has broken apart the water. It's broken the water into hydrogen ions, oxygen, and electrons. The hydrogen ions, they're going to combine with a coenzyme that's also present within the chloroplast, NADP, and it's going to form NADPH. So think of it like this: NADP add H plus, and that's going to form NADPH. Okay, and that's what's called reduced NADP. And remember all the letters, because in respiration it's different letters. In photosynthesis is NADP, in respiration is NAD. That's it. Okay, now we've talked about what happens to the hydrogen ions. What happens to the electrons? Well, the electrons, they're going to be passed along a chain of carrier proteins. Okay, and we've got a diagram that we're going to look at, which will make more sense. But basically, along the membrane of a chloroplast, let's say that this is our membrane. In our membrane, there's going to be a lot of carrier proteins. Okay, there's going to be a lot of carrier proteins embedded within our membrane. What's going to happen is that the electrons, they're going to jump across these carrier proteins. They're going to move across these carrier proteins. And when they're moving across, they're going to be releasing the energy that is required for the light dependent reaction, because obviously photosynthesis will require energy. It will need that energy from somewhere. It gets that energy from these electrons jumping across carrier proteins, because when they jump across, they release energy at each stage of the process. Okay, so we've looked at what happens to the hydrogen ions. We've looked at what happens to the electrons. What happens to the oxygen? Well, the oxygen, it's either used in respiration because we need oxygen for respiration, or it just diffuses out of the leaf through the stomata. That's what happens to the oxygen. We don't need oxygen for photosynthesis. That's why the oxygen which is produced, it's either used in the respiration of the plant, or it just diffuses out and we use it as humans to respire. Okay, so as you can see, the photolysis of water is a really important stage. This is basically where you get all your reactants ready. So just to summarize what's happening in the photolysis of water, you've got your leaf, you've got your chloroplast within your leaf, you've got your chlorophyll. Okay, now the chlorophyll is going to be absorbing specific wavelengths of light. Okay, now once it's absorbed the light, it uses the light to break down water. It breaks down the water into oxygen, electrons, and hydrogen ions. Those three parts it breaks down water into. Okay, now the oxygen, it's either used in respiration or it just diffuses out of the leaf through the stomata so we can inhale that oxygen. The electrons, they're going to jump across carrier proteins which are embedded within the chloroplast membrane. And the reason why they jump across is because we need energy to carry out photosynthesis. So those electrons, when they're moving and jumping across these carrier proteins, they're releasing energy at each stage. Okay, and then the hydrogen ions, they are going to go and they're going to combine with a coenzyme which is known as NADP. Once they've combined with that coenzyme, that produces the NADP, which means that it has gained a hydrogen. Reduction is the gain of hydrogen, so it becomes NADPH. And NADPH isn't required for this stage of photosynthesis. It's required for the next stage of photosynthesis. That's when it's going to be used. Okay, so that's the photolysis of water. That's the first stage done. The next stage of photosynthesis is the next stage of the light dependent reaction is known as the photoionization of chlorophyll. And this is a very short stage. It's not sort of as in detail like the photolysis of water, which you need to know. The photoionization of chlorophyll basically describes how the light energy which has been absorbed by the chlorophyll causes the electrons to become excited and leave the chlorophyll. Okay, so we're talking about over here, we're saying over here that the electrons are jumping across the carrier proteins that are embedded within the membrane. Where do they get that energy to jump across? They get that energy from the light that the chlorophyll has absorbed. Okay, so the light energy not only splits the water into oxygen, hydrogen, and electrons, but the light energy is used to also excite the electrons. Okay, they will excite the electrons, causing the electrons to leave the chlorophyll and go to the carrier proteins which are embedded within the membrane of the chloroplast. And that gives the electrons enough energy to jump across the carrier proteins, and they will release their own energy once they've jumped across. That's the purpose of them. Okay, and then the energy which has come from the release of electrons, it can be used to make ADP and more NADPH in the next stage of photosynthesis of the light dependent reaction, which we're going to look at in a minute. Okay, so those are the first two stages of photosynthesis. Remember, photosynthesis is split into two reactions, two stages. The first stage is the light dependent reaction. The second stage is the light independent reaction. The light dependent reaction requires the light. The light independent reaction doesn't require light. It requires oxygen. It requires carbon dioxide. The first stage was photolysis of water, which we looked at on the previous slide. The second stage is the photoionization of chlorophyll. So what's happening over here? The light has ionized the chlorophyll. It has excited the chlorophyll, causing the electrons to leave the chlorophyll and move along the carrier proteins, which are embedded within the membrane. Okay? So that's your photoionization of chlorophyll. The final actual stage there is chemiosmosis, and this is where your products are formed as well, which are going to be used in the next stage in the light independent reaction of the Calvin cycle. So chemiosmosis, I've put a diagram over here. So where we are at now, so these circles that you can see over here, these circles are carrier proteins. These are your carrier proteins, and what's happening is that the electrons are currently jumping across these carrier proteins because the light has ionized the chlorophyll. So in chemiosmosis, what is actually happening? Well, the electrons, they are moving across these embedded proteins and they're releasing energy at each movement. Okay, so we've already discussed that already. They're jumping across from protein to protein to protein and they're releasing energy at each stage of movement. And why are they releasing energy? Because the energy is required to pump protons, which are H pluses, from the stroma to the lumen. So this is your stroma on this side, and this is your lumen on this side. There's going to be hydrogen ions present on this side, and there's going to be hydrogen ions present on the lumen side. As you can see, we've got hydrogen ions present over here as well. Now, these hydrogen ions from the stroma need to be pumped to the other side. Okay, they need to be pumped to the other side into the thylakoid lumen. That's what the energy is used for. So we know that the electrons, they're jumping across from protein to protein. They're releasing energy at each stage of their movement. And that energy is used to pump the hydrogen ions from the stroma to the lumen. And you'll understand why this is happening once we've looked at the whole process. Okay? This means that there will be a high concentration of protons, of hydrogen ions in the lumen. So on this side, there will be more hydrogen ions present. Okay, and there will also be more hydrogen ions present because the photolysis of water is also occurring in the lumen. Okay, so what's happening now is an electrochemical gradient is being created. Now, what does that actually mean? That just means that there are more hydrogen ions on the lumen side compared to the stroma side, which means that there is a large difference of hydrogen ions that you have. Now, what's going to happen is because you have a high hydrogen ion concentration on this side, the hydrogen ions are going to pass through this structure over here. Okay, it's going to pass through this structure over here called ATP synthase. Okay, so they're going to pass through ATP synthase, and whenever hydrogen ions pass through ATP synthase, they're basically going to produce ATP. So ATP is going to be produced from ADP and PI once the hydrogen ions have passed through ATP synthase. And the reason why this is happening is because there's a high concentration of hydrogen ions on this side, and there is a low concentration of hydrogen ions on this side. So it's going to pass through the ATP synthase because of that electrochemical gradient which has been created. Okay. Now, Once hydrogen ions have passed through, the hydrogen ions come to this side. When the hydrogen ions have sort of reached the other side, some of the hydrogen ions, they're recycled. So they go back through the whole process once again. So they move across, pass through, and it occurs in a cycle. So some of those protons, they're recycled. Some of them, they are picked up by NADP to form NADPH for the light independent reaction. Okay, because NADPH is required for the light independent reaction to occur. So that's your chemiosmosis stage of the light dependent reaction. Okay, and that's basically the final stage that you're looking at. Okay, so just to summarize, we had the photolysis of water, where you have your chloroplast and your chlorophyll. They are going to absorb light energy from the sun, and that light energy is used to break down the water. The water is broken down into oxygen, hydrogen, and electrons. The hydrogens are going to combine with a coenzyme called NADP. When it combines with a coenzyme called NADP, it reduces that coenzyme to form NADPH. Okay, the oxygen either is used in respiration by the plant, or it just passes out through the stomata so humans can take in the oxygen to respire. And the electrons, they're going to be passing on from proteins, carrier proteins, which are embedded within the membrane of the chloroplast. Okay, then you've got your photoionization of the chlorophyll. Now, photoionization just describes how the light energy absorbed not only splits the water, but it also excites the electrons. It also gives the electrons a lot of energy so they can move between carrier proteins. So when they move through these carrier proteins, they will be releasing energy at each stage of movement. And then we come on to the chemiosmosis stage. The energy that is released by the electrons, it is used to pump the protons which are present in the stroma of the chloroplast, which is just here, across into the thylakoid lumen. And when they're pumped across, that increases the concentration of hydrogen ions on the lumen side of the chloroplast. And because we've got a difference in concentration, there's going to be a high concentration of hydrogen ions, also due to the photolysis of water. As you can see, photolysis of water is occurring here. An electrochemical gradient is created. And then that's going to cause hydrogen ions to pass through ATP synthase to the other side. And when it passes through ATP synthase, it's going to convert ADP and PI to produce ATP, which is required for the next stage of photosynthesis as well. Now, once the hydrogen ions have passed through, some of them are recycled and they pass through the whole process once again. And some of them combine with some NADP just floating around, and they form NADPH, reduce NADP, which can then pass through to the next stage of photosynthesis, which is the light independent reaction. Okay, so that's the process of the light dependent reaction that you need to be aware of. Now, when it comes to essays, when you're writing essays for paper 3 biology, essays, you basically have to explain the importance of something, the importance of water, the importance of proteins, the importance of ions, the importance of membranes. And the reason why I've included this these essay points is because this topic is very commonly used. So if you have a look at this slide over here, these are the key essay points that you are required to know for your biology paper. So when you get the essay question at the end of your paper 3, whatever question comes up, it is very likely that this topic will relate to either one of the questions. You're going to be given 2 questions and you can get to choose between the 2 questions. This topic is very likely to be one of your topics that you choose because it just covers so many topics that are present within sort of the topics that they can ask you. I've put up over here some example questions which have come up in the past. Okay, so we've had an essay on the importance of ions, the importance of proteins, the importance of membranes, the importance of water, the importance of movement in living organisms, the importance of ATP. Okay, we've had questions such as this, many different types of questions. But if we have a look at this topic of the light dependent reaction, let's talk about the importance of ions. As you can see, we've got hydrogen ions, which means that we can talk about this topic. The importance of proteins, we've got proteins which are embedded in the chloroplast membrane. Okay, we've also got ATP synthase, which is an enzyme, which is also a protein. Okay, so we can talk about the importance of proteins, the importance of membrane. We're talking about the chloroplast membrane where the proteins are embedded in and the electrons are being transported across them. The importance of water, photolysis of water that's occurring, the importance of movement, the electrons are moving down the electron transport chain. The importance of ATP. ATP is being produced from ATP synthase. All of these topics relate to the light dependent reaction. So I would take a screenshot of this method. This method is basically everything that you need to write for your essay. Okay, and if it says the importance of ions, you just have to write the same method but focus on the ions aspect of it. If it says importance of proteins, you literally write this down but focus on the proteins aspect of it. If it says importance of membranes, write this down, focus on the membranes aspect of it. And again, you get the idea. Okay, and that's what makes this a very common essay topic to include. And many people struggle with essays because they don't know what to write, they don't know how to link it to the question. But it's basically for an essay, just learn your topics, just learn, model 6 mock answers, 6 marks of methods which occur across the whole of A Level AQA Biology. This is one of the methods which occurs, this is one of the processes which occurs. The next stage of photosynthesis, the light independent reaction or the Calvin cycle, is another process which occurs. So you can include that in your essay as well. We'll be looking at essay points for that process as well. There's many different points. If we think back to sort of year 1, year 12 biology that you would have done, there's loads of processes over there. There's the process of digestion. There's the some essays, for example, the importance of ATP. You can include it from the biological molecules unit, where you've looked at the importance of ATP, the uses of ATP. There, you basically just have to link different aspects of the spec, and this is an area of the spec that many people love to link to essay points that they have.